Is the American president a Russian sympathizer? Donald Trump defends Vladimir Putin against his own American intelligence agencies. I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is the Helsinki summit. The meeting happened under a shadow of indictments that were handed down by the US against 12 Russian agents. And standing alongside Vladimir Putin, Trump openly criticized the CIA and the FBI for concluding that Moscow interfered in the 2016 presidential election. When one journalist asked if Russia should be held accountable in any way, the US president saved his sharpest criticism for Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, who's investigating allegations of collusion between US and Russian officials. Trump said the inquiry was ridiculous and called it a witch hunt. Critics, both Democrats and Republicans, were dumbfounded, with former CIA Director John Brennan calling Trump's remarks nothing short of treasonous. So, is Donald Trump working for the American people or against them? Natalie Pohernan reports.
US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have met before. But the Helsinki summit was arranged to give them unparalleled face time.
So I've been saying, and I'm sure you've heard over the years, and as I campaign, that getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Настало время поговорить обстоятельно о наших двусторонних отношениях и по различным болевым точкам в мире, их достаточно много.
We don't know what happened in their closed-door meeting. There were interpreters, but no official record keepers. The presidents say they discussed, among other things, Syria, Israel, Ukraine, North Korea, the Iran nuclear deal, and the 2016 US presidential election. Trump was asked about Russian interference in the US election. He described the investigation into Russian involvement as a disaster for America.
There was no collusion. I didn't know the president. There was nobody to collude with. There was no collusion with the campaign.
По поводу того, кому верить и кому не верить, и можно ли вообще верить. Никому нельзя верить. С чего вы взяли, что президент Трамп мне доверяет, а я ему в полной степени доверяю? Он защищает интересы Соединенных Штатов Америки. Я защищаю интересы Российской Федерации.
Trump described the meeting as only the beginning. So what will be the end goal for US-Russia relations? Last week, a US grand jury indicted 12 Russian military officers on conspiring to interfere in the 2016 presidential election.
The defendants worked for 2 units of the main intelligence directorate of the Russian General Staff, known as the GRU.
On Sunday, Russian national Maria Butina was arrested and charged in the US with conspiracy to act as an agent of the Russian government. She's accused of trying to cultivate back-channel lines of communication with American politicians. Trump's campaign for office and his presidency have been inextricably linked to the Russian government and Putin. US intelligence agencies, congressional committees, and the Justice Department have all pointed towards Russian meddling in the race, with more expected.
There should be no doubt that Russia perceived that its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 US midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations.
Last year, Trump said he did back the findings of US agencies. But this week, he stood by Putin as the Russian leader denied any involvement in the elections.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Placing his trust in Putin as part of a deal to improve on what he called their extraordinary relationship. Natalie Pohernan, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Moscow by Andrei Baklitsky. He's a consultant for the PIR Center, which focuses on Russian affairs. In Taipei, former chairman of Republicans Abroad, Ross Feingold. He now works for the political risk consultancy firm DC International Advisory. And finally, from Washington, D.C. is Larry Korb, a senior fellow at the liberal think tank Center for American Progress. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Larry Korb, let me start with you. The Helsinki summit. The former CIA director Brennan calls Trump's performance there, or the press conference at least, treasonous. Would you go that far yourself?
Well, there's no doubt about the fact that President Trump undermined American interests, whether it would hold up in a court of law that he did this on purpose, but he certainly didn't fulfill his constitutional responsibilities to preserve and protect the United States.
Ross, he undermined American interests. Would you agree with that?
Well, obviously, there are many people in the United States Congress and certainly in the media and other pundits who, in the hours after the press conference, are saying that the president should have handled it differently. But whether United States security or the safety of the American people is any weaker than it was prior to the press conference, and keeping in mind our focus is on the press conference, not any substantive agreements between the two countries. Again, I think it's open to debate whether the security of the United States or the American people is any weaker than it was prior to the press conference.
Okay, but again, I mean, I wasn't asking if the security was weaker, but the fact that, let's look at one of the details, Ross, the fact that all Putin had to do was say, it wasn't me with regards election interference, that was enough for Trump to take him at his word against the advice of his intelligence agencies, against the advice of the FBI. How does that sit with you as an American?
Well, most Americans who have taken the time to read the indictments and the reports issued by various congressional committees have taken the view that Russia did, in fact, interfere with the election. But all of us on TV or the reports have clearly not persuaded the president to take a different view. But again, the key thing here is the United States any less safe? Is our elections, our next major election in November, any less safe because of what President Trump said? I think that's, again, open to debate whether the president has damaged American security by his view on whether or not Putin is telling the truth.
Andre, they must be loving this in Moscow, looking at how divided the U.S. over this and how angry on both sides of the political spectrum so many people are at their president, which seems to be seen as a victory for Vladimir Putin and a defeat for Donald Trump. Is that, I guess, going down well in Moscow?
I don't think that this is how it's perceived in Moscow. President Putin went to Helsinki with an idea to solve or improve relations with the United States. The summit ended it up with few deliverables, and if anything, it produced a huge backlash at home. Russia is sort of getting used to this kind of relationship when President Trump promises something and then he cannot deliver because of the constraints at home. But I don't think that the results of the summit are seen very positively in Russia in terms of deliverables.
Okay, so talking about deliverables, Larry Korb, when we go beyond Trump saying nice things about Putin and saying he trusts him and he doesn't trust, the FBI and the CIA and whatever, when we look at the geopolitics, you were at the table, you were within the State Department, you were within the corridors of power. A sober look at it. The sanctions on Russia are still there. The U.S. position on Ukraine is still the same. The U.S. believes Crimea belongs to Ukraine. The two are very different when it comes to Syria. With all of that in mind, is this just a bit of an overreaction at the president, who probably doesn't have the finesse of a Barack Obama or someone else, just having a bad press conference?
No, I think it was. He didn't even read the briefing papers that he was given by his own staff. And the other thing that really worries me, this was an opportunity to deal with the most critical issue between the United States and Russia, and that's the strategic arms limitation agreement, which will expire in 2021 unless something is done. President Putin a year ago called President Trump and said, we can extend it for 5 years without going through the Senate or the Russian Duma. I think that makes sense. Trump said, no, he didn't want to do it. It was a bad deal. And that, in fact, anything that Obama negotiated, in his view, is a bad deal. Well, it's the deadline for that is getting close. Both the Russians and the United States are modernizing their nuclear arsenals. He should have taken the opportunity at this summit to say, all right, I accept your offer, let's extend it, and then let's work on a new agreement, and also on other arms agreements like the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement negotiated by President Reagan and Secretary General Gorbachev, which both sides have accused the others of violating. That was the key issue. These other things, I agree that, you know, they don't undermine U.S. security directly, but that was a missed opportunity because you had the two of them there. They could have agreed on that, and it can just be ratified. Our ambassadors could sign it, the secretaries of state and the foreign ministers could sign it, and that would put that issue away for a while while we work on what to do next with nuclear weapons.
Andre, compare for me how the Russians feel about Donald Trump compared to how they felt about Barack Obama.
Well, there is this thing which happens regularly in Russia when a new US president comes and everybody believes that we'll have a new start and that this, no pun intended, and this will, you know, bring us to some kind of sustainable relationship. It was the same with George W. Bush, then it was the same with Barack Obama, and he was very welcomed in Moscow when he was first elected, and it's the same with Donald Trump. But then, as the times go by and the divergent points between two countries multiply, every next president ends up as not the best option for Russia. And so I guess President Trump will be making the same turn in the end, unfortunately.
Ross, I want to bring to your attention a tweet from the former head of the KKK, David Duke. I'm going to read this out to you. He said, "Bravo Trump, bravo Russia, bravo to all the true American patriots who put America first and peace and justice first before the Zionist deep evil state ruling American media and politics. Russia has values America once had, and America the values that communist Russia had." As a conservative American, the fact that, I don't know, the KKK wants to smuggle themselves into this and claim a piece of it, it's a little ugly and icky, isn't it?
Well, certainly it's disgusting, and there's no room for that in mainstream politics in the United States, whether on the left or the right, whether among progressives or conservatives. And President Trump has had to battle accusations that he welcomes the support of this element of the American political scene. And he's done a fairly outspoken job of saying that he doesn't welcome their support. It's never enough for the more liberal media outlets in the United States. But yes, it's something that he'll continue to battle. However, in the scheme of things, this is largely irrelevant because it doesn't have any bearing whatsoever on policy decisions in the White House.
Is that true, Larry Korb, that this doesn't have any bearing on policy decisions? Because we saw how Trump had, in many ways, had a certain constituency in the build-up to the election. You can call it the alt-right, you can call it the far-right, whatever you want to call it. And there seemed to be this kissing point among those, especially in Russia, who had certain ideas of white supremacism, if you like. That is being expressed by someone like David Duke now. And after this meeting, we're seeing him feeling kind of emboldened that these two leaders represent something new and powerful in the world. Does David Duke's sentiment mean anything in terms of politics and policy?
I hope not. And unfortunately, you know, President Trump, when we had the riots in Charlottesville, said they're bad, you know, good people on both sides. I mean, you know, neo-Nazis, well, they're not good people. And I think he undermines his moral leadership at home and the world. The United States is just not an overwhelming military and economic power, but it stands for something, and American ideals. That's what people have fought and died for, and he is undermining those, and that's what I really worry about. I mean, I wonder after that meeting with Putin if Putin will feel emboldened now. Well, maybe I can go into the Baltics. He said it was okay to be in Ukraine. And when he was asked the day before what is the biggest threat to the United States, he said the European Union rather than dealing with Russia and China.
Yeah, so, Andre, the fact that Trump calls the EU a foe, the fact that Trump is fighting with Justin Trudeau at the moment, or was most recently fighting with Justin Trudeau. The fact that his traditional allies are not quite sure about what he thinks of them, especially the NATO alliance, and he's being very kind to Vladimir Putin. Does that mean the Russians have a clear path to do whatever they want to? And for example, they can go into the Baltics, as Larry Korb says, and maybe Trump won't do anything about it?
Well, first of all, this whole Trump phenomenon in the foreign policy creates strange bedfellows. You're right that he said that European Union is a foe and the US are in kind of trade war with the European Union. But the same tariffs have been applied to Russian steel and aluminum companies. And Donald Trump has accused Germany to signing a contract for a pipeline from Russian gas, which is counterintuitive if you think that he's a best friend of Vladimir Putin. I wouldn't think that Russia feels super emboldened to do whatever it wants. At the same time, Russia was doing what it perceived as right thing with the previous president. The previous US president will probably do it. Now, I don't see any Russian interest in doing anything in the Baltics. But if you remember Crimea, I guess it wasn't the main issue what US president is thinking on the issue.
Okay, so Larry Korb, maybe less constrained, but hardly a green light to do whatever the hell they want to.
Well, we hope not. And as I say, you never know what's going on in Putin's mind. I mean, if anybody would have said that he would seize part of, Ukraine after violating the Minsk agreement with the Russians had signed on to with the United States and the Ukrainians and the British if Ukraine got rid of its nuclear weapons. He violated that. And yes, sanctions were put on, but Trump did not want these sanctions put on. If it was up to him, he would pull them off. And so the idea that Putin may, as a result of this conference, say, well, he accused me of meddling in the election. I denied it, and he went along with me rather than his own intelligence. Maybe I can push the envelope here and see. And that's what we find. Most wars are started because of people not appreciating, what would happen and don't have the right view. And again, given what he did to NATO last week and the comments he made, Putin's got to wonder whether they'll stick together if, in fact, he does something like go into the Baltics.
Yeah, Ross, we saw last week's indictment of 12 Russian military officers in the hacking and leaking of Democratic Party emails. They shed some light on the fact that the Russians were, looking to maybe make a bit of mischief and sow some discord within the American electorate, even if it wasn't to actually hack the elections as such. We saw the situation with Maria Butina and her charged, trying to wield influence on behalf of the Russians to try and, mix things up a little bit, keep the Americans busy. Is there any amount of evidence that has come from the Mueller investigation, Ross, that you would look at and say, okay, maybe there's something here and maybe something was awry? Maybe they didn't go all the way, maybe they didn't actually rig the election, but they certainly did meddle and play games. And this president is doing his country a disservice by failing to even recognize that in the face of proper, authentic, credible investigations.
Well, the investigations have proven to be credible, and anyone who's taken the time to read the indictments, whether it was the most recent Mueller indictments or the earlier indictments of the Russian Internet Agency, it's clear that both the investigative agencies in the Department of Justice, the Special Counsel's Office, as well as our intelligence agencies, whether it's the FBI or the CIA and the other parts of the intelligence community, have done a very thorough job proving that Russia did interfere in the U.S. election. Whether they changed any votes, as of now, it appears very unlikely. But clearly, Russians working with the Russian government were involved. President Trump is not going to change the way he talks about it in a public forum, though. And I think we have to manage our own expectations for how President Trump is going to deal with the facts. But look, we know that the evidence is clear about Russia's behavior. And there's a consensus across the United States political spectrum, both among Democrats and many Republicans. Not all Republicans. There's still Republicans in Congress who question the evidence. But it's clear what Russia did, and most people don't dispute that any longer.
Andrei, is the view in Moscow that we didn't do anything wrong, this is nonsense, or sure, we tried to meddle a little bit, but America does the same, and it's all par for the course, everybody plays this game?
The official Russian position is that Russia did not interfere in U.S. election, and that's being maintained, and I don't think it will change whatever the investigation in the United States proves. But what you do see in Russia is the better understanding of the fact that this is a very sensitive topic in the United States. Because I remember when it was, beginning the investigation, a lot of people here and people who study United States are saying, look, they simply are reacting. Obviously, there was no change to the voting itself. Obviously, why is this fast? Now we see change, and Russia more and more understands that some nerve was pinched here, and the general U.S. Public is furious about this. And you can see at the summit, President Putin saying, like, look, we can cooperate with Mueller investigation. If they send people here, they can be present when we question the people which were charged. So you can see the dynamic here. Unfortunately, this was missed in the backlash in the United States after the press conference.
Yeah, talking about pinching a nerve, Larry Korb, did you see the New York Daily News front cover today?
I did.
Open treason. So basically, Trump assassinating Uncle Sam, and with Putin at his side. So let me kind of expand on this a little bit. For those who feel that liberals or Democrats or both or progressives, whatever you want to call them, anybody who's anti-Trump, they have this feeling that sure, there's some stuff going on with Russia and maybe this guy in the optics and so forth is not dealing with it properly. But for those who look at something like that and feel that maybe the left has lost its mind because they just can't handle that Trump is the president, is there a case for that?
No, I don't think so. I think basically, and as you've already pointed out, you've had a lot of Republicans. If you read what the most, damning statement yesterday was from John McCain when he, talked about what Trump had done. And yes, John Brennan worked for President Obama, but he's a career intelligence officer. So it's not just Democrats or quote unquote liberals doing this. I think the fact of the matter is that yesterday was probably a turning point even for many Republicans who stayed with Trump because they've been worried about their re-election, chances. The whole host of them came. Lindsey Graham, who had been a big supporter, the senator from South Carolina, came out and criticized them. So I think yesterday really was something that just didn't offend liberals like some of his immigration policies do. I think this really offended the people who are concerned about national security in our country from both parties.
Yeah, and it's interesting. And for the record, Senator John McCain, as you mentioned, to be fair to you, on the right, said, and I quote, I'll quote this before I leave you, gentlemen, he said Trump's press conference appearance was one of the most disgraceful performances by an American president in memory and a tragic mistake. President Trump proved not only unable but unwilling to stand up to Putin. No prior president has ever abased himself more abjectly before a tyrant. Not mincing his words. Gentlemen, I'm out of time. I've got to move on. But I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Larry Korb, Ross Feingold, and Andrei Baklitsky. Thanks again. Still ahead on the program, are French-backed forces losing the fight against terrorists in Africa's Sahel? And we ask whether WhatsApp is responsible for the fake news that's leading to mob violence in India and what can be done to stop it. The Sahel. It's the region of Africa between the Sahara and the Savannah that includes Senegal, Mauritania, Mali, Nigeria, and Burkina Faso. And it's under threat by fighters linked to Al-Qaeda. The group has staged multiple deadly attacks, most recently on the headquarters of the military force trying to eradicate them from the area. What's more, the presence of 4,000 French soldiers who are meant to help may actually be driving up local support for the militants. With more, here's Haider Abbasi.
Mali's military comes under attack. A car bomb targets a convoy in the northern city of Gao. 2 civilians are killed. Among the wounded are several French soldiers. Such attacks are surging in Central and Western Africa, a region known as the Sahel. Hundreds of people have been killed there in the last couple of years. Analysts say Africa is the new battleground against terrorists. The French soldiers in Mali are part of a larger force known as Operation Barkhane. Working with regional armies, its aim is to confront the threat posed by militant groups. Around 4,000 French soldiers operate in 5 African countries, all of them former colonies. The operation began in 2014, but analysts say the force has struggled to contain the threat from militant groups. Last month, fighters targeted the headquarters of a regional military task force, the G5 Sahel. A car rigged with explosives drove into the compound in Mali. Gunmen then fired at the troops inside. 2 soldiers and 4 militants were killed. The group Jamaat Nasr al-Islam al-Muslimin says it was behind the attack. Just days later, France's President Emmanuel Macron visited Mauritania for an African Union summit.
The enemy keeps attacking, but we keep attacking back. These last few months, we have hit hard, and we will keep doing that. They can be sure of that. Until the end, our determination is complete.
The Sahel is considered a lawless and impoverished region. Groups like Daesh have exploited the conditions to recruit members. And despite the presence of French and UN soldiers, militants have taken advantage of porous borders to spread across the area. There are now several terror networks operating in the Sahel. The most powerful is the JNIM, which was formed after 4 al-Qaeda-backed factions joined forces in March last year. Its fighters have targeted bases, airports and hotels in cities across West Africa. There's also the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, which has been growing in Niger. Its members killed 5 Nigerian and 4 American soldiers in October. It was the US's biggest combat loss on the continent since the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993. Combat missions for American troops in Africa have now been restricted. France had hoped the G5 Sahel force would allow its own troops to withdraw, but as armed groups grow and launch more daring attacks, that now seems unlikely. So is a military response the most effective way to deal with armed groups in the Sahel? Or should there be more focus on social development and good governance? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Jonathan Rosenthal. He's the Africa editor at The Economist, who's argued in favor of Western involvement in the Sahel. And in Perpignan, France, is peace and security analyst Abdelkader Abdurrahman. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Jonathan, let me start with you. This G5 Sahel force, are they adequately responding to the threat of extremism in the region?
Not yet. It is very early days for the G5. There is a monstrous and growing threat at the moment. The G5 is an attempt to try to say, can we get the countries in the region to start primarily taking responsibility for themselves? But as we've seen, both in recent weeks when there was an attack on one of the G5 infrastructure centres, that they still have a way to go before they're really able to stand up and confront these issues head on.
Okay, so Abdelkader Abdurrahman, that suicide attack on the G5 Sahel headquarters, is that enough proof that this group of countries doesn't quite know how to deal with the threat yet?
Yes, it did. Indeed, the G5 Sahel is not ready to fight terrorism in the region. And as our guest said, it has yet to be fully operational, but it is very unlikely that it will ever be operational.
So if it's unlikely that it will ever be operational, why do we all bother, Jonathan?
Well, so I'm going to disagree with that. I think that we are in the early days of this. One is seeing a real effort to put in the resources, whether it's the money that is being paid for, a lot of it coming from the European Union, whether it is the money that needs to go into upgrading these capabilities, or whether it is also just the sort of softer training missions that are going on in the region. We're seeing a number of different countries involved in training and upgrading countries' capabilities. So we are seeing, a genuine effort to stand up a force that can certainly respond to terrorist actions and can certainly, conduct operations against extremists. That said, there is a very long way to go, and I think as much as we're about to disagree on whether the G5 will ever be able to stand up, I think we do also, we probably will agree that there is a lot more that needs to happen as well. It's not just about putting soldiers on the ground, whether they're local or Western. It's about trying to address the issues that face some of these governments.
Okay, so before we move forward, let's try and understand the nature of the threat a bit better. Abdul Qadir, we have names. We have Al-Qaeda affiliates, Jamaatul Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, a couple of other groups mentioned. Help me understand the nature of the threat. Help me understand how they operate, where they operate, and how many members they have.
We can name Al-Qaeda, we can name the Jamaat al-Nusra, we can name them all. The question is not them, and the question is to ask, why are these groups there? What are the causes of these groups? How can they, how have they managed to set foot there? The question is, what are the illnesses? What are the roots, the causes and the problems of Mali and in Sahel are poverty. The problems of Mali is corruption. The problems of Mali are bad or good governance, lack of good governance, and the development. These are the problems, and as long as these causes are not addressed and fully tackled and are tackled appropriately, then terrorism will remain there.
Okay, but Jonathan, these countries are not a monolith. Yes. Niger is different from Mauritania, which is different from Burkina Faso, which is different from Chad, which is different from Mali, and so forth, right? So understood, okay, poverty, people being disenfranchised, whatever it is, it leads them into the hands of these groups, right? But how do you actually do it when these are separate nation states, each with slightly different problems and contexts? Jonathan?
Yes. So firstly, I would just like to expand slightly just on the scale of this issue, because it really does stretch all the way across the Sahel, north and south of it, from broadly, and so I'm not specifically saying only Sahel countries, but it stretches from Al-Shabaab and Somalia in the east, all the way through. It goes through Lake Chad, through Nigeria, and goes all the way into the east, and you've also got countries north of the Sahara. You've got Algeria suffers from some of this. You've got Libya suffering from some of it. So we really are talking about a massive set of conflicts that combined last year resulted in about 10,000 civilian deaths. So a massive disaster. And you're right in saying that each of these is in some way different. That the reason that a young Kenyan from the north of Kenya will cross the border into Somalia and join Al-Shabaab is going to be different from the reason that someone might in Mali join up with one of the groups there. So these are, in some senses, idiosyncratic. It is about local corruption, but it is also about the fact that there are also pull factors, and there is an appeal, and some of that is ideological, and the fact that people are saying, we can explain our poverty and misfortune in many ways, but a very large number of young men are saying, we think that the answer to this is not sort of liberalism or capitalism or socialism. A large number of people think it is a form of their interpretation of Sharia.
Okay, so with that in mind,
that is perhaps a unifying factor.
With that in mind, Abdul Qadir Abdurrahman, has it dovetailed with the fact that Daesh and Al-Qaeda in other hotspots that probably get more attention, these two have been losing in many ways, particularly Daesh, losing land in their caliphate. Are we seeing this flare up now in the Sahel because it's been suppressed elsewhere and it needs to come up here, and there's an ideological appeal to people in the prime social conditions for their message to resonate?
I mean, the question of terrorism in the Sahel was there, and the threat of terrorism was there before started around in Iraq. So we cannot say that Daesh is taking the opportunity. Obviously, it will take the opportunity to travel and to move westward, excuse me. But I don't think that it's an opportunity. But I would like to come back to a point where we're talking about ideology, and we were talking about financing. And this is something I'm very worried about. Is we're talking about financing of the G5. The G5 Sahel doesn't know how to. This year, Paris managed to gather about 450 million euros for the G5 Sahel. We know that the G5 Sahel needs around 80 million each year to be operational.
Right.
Out of those 450, just last point, about 100 million euros were pledged by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the main exporter of radical ideology in the Sahel. It opens countless schools.
This is a good. Okay, so this is a good point, right?
Something we have.
Right. So okay, so this is a great point. So Jonathan, we have people like Idriss Déby, the leader of Chad, saying we need more money in order to defeat this threat, and countries like Saudi Arabia are offering money. Are they going to be pouring more fuel to the fire?
I think one really needs to think very hard about this, and I think you're putting your finger on it, that one needs to think hard about how does one try to instill better governance, attack some of these root causes, deal with some of the issues of corruption and bad governance, often by leaders, and in many cases autocratic leaders who are saying, don't talk to us about governance and human rights, just give us the money. And in many cases, the money is going not just into financing the spread of ideology, as has just been pointed out, but also into creating elite military units that can often have an unintended side effect, or unintended consequence, which is that we're creating these presidential or praetorian guards that are keeping autocrats in power. So there is a real sort of moral hazard here between, on the one hand, wanting to deal with this threat of extremism and create competent security forces, and on the other hand, ending up unwittingly propping up some quite autocratic regimes that are creating the conditions that lead to these extremists.
Jonathan, 4,000 French troops across the wide desert expanse. Some say they're a help, some say they're a hindrance. Macron feels like he wants to do more. Do you think Macron needs to do more, and what's needed is a greater injection of French troops?
Well, so I think what one needs is a greater injection in general of troops, of trained, competent troops. So yes, more French, and I think yes, there should be more, sort of Europeans and other allies who are willing to engage in this. If one looks at the trends across that very broad set of conflicts in the Sahel, in places like Nigeria, the trends are not looking positive at all. The trends are going very badly. One is seeing more civilians being attacked at the moment. One is seeing more civilians being displaced.
Okay.
And something needs to be done to stop that.
Abdul Qadir, more troops. That's the answer. At least in the short term, you need to stop the fighting, right?
Well, this is what was told in 2013. In the short term, we need to send troops. This is what Servo was sent for. Servo was there to initially, we were told that Servo would be there for a few weeks, months at months. 5 years on, Servo was transformed into Barkhane, and Barkhane was transformed into French troops there. So I don't think that more troops in the Sahel are needed, and especially French or European troops. What the Sahel needs, apart from what we mentioned, the questions of poverty to be tackled and education and so on and so forth, the region needs a real wider regional cooperation. The G5 Sahel, let's remind that the G5 Sahel is nothing else but a duplicate of the CMOC, which was funded in 2009, which includes the states of Mauritania, Niger, Mali, and Algeria. Algeria, which is, let's remember, the strongest and the most capable country, the most efficient and capable army in the
Right.
This is what has to be done.
Okay.
It has to be, and the G5 Sahel is just a duplicate.
Okay.
Just as the Nuer process is being destroyed by G5 Sahel.
Jonathan, very finally, when we look at all the acronyms and all the different groups, G5 and EU and the French and so on and so forth, the two that are notably absent when it comes to a commitment to trying to solve this problem, the United Nations, the UN, and the African Union, the AU, at least institutionally. Where are they? What's their problem?
Well, I'm going to disagree with you slightly because, again, we're talking about a lot of conflicts. And if one looks at Somalia, there is an AU-led mission there. AMISOM is really the AU, and it is neighboring countries. So one is seeing, Kenyan and Ethiopian and Ugandan troops putting their lives on the line. So one is seeing that. One is also seeing quite considerable UN involvement in Mali and other places. So I'm going to disagree with you slightly on that. But that said, I do agree that one really ought to be seeing a lot more of that one really ought to be seeing the African Union taking greater responsibility. One hears a lot of rhetoric from politicians, in particular in the AU, saying we need to have African solutions to these problems and African-led solutions. And let's see them. I'd like to see the AU stepping up.
Okay. Jonathan Rosenthal and Abdulkader Abdurrahman. Unfortunately, I've got to move on. But it was good talking to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
You cannot evade your accountability and responsibility by merely saying that we have created the platform and rest is none of your concern. The use, abuse, misuse of your platform, particularly which leads to killing of innocent people, is plainly not acceptable.
The rumor mill on WhatsApp has led to a series of murders across India. The accusations range from child kidnappings to people eating beef, which is a sin for Hindus. Once these fake claims go viral, they have at times led to mob violence. At least 30 people have recently been killed. And India's highest court has now asked the federal government to enact new laws to address the threat posed by social media posts. Meanwhile, some officials are asking if WhatsApp and its parent company Facebook will intervene. Well, to discuss this, we're joined by journalist Govindraj Etiraj, who's the founder of Boom Live, an organization that points out fake news online. Good to have you on the program, Govindraj. Let me ask you, you're going to try and debunk fake news. How do you actually stop people from, acting upon their impulses? Because it's very difficult for you to convince someone otherwise after they've made up their mind, right?
Right. So, what we do is really aimed at what I would call the institutional end of the consuming audience, which is people who already know, who understand, who are in positions of power, politicians, leaders, and so on. So, when they, for instance, forward something which is evidently false, or if they share information or they retweet stuff, and then we point it out, we obviously have an impact. So that's where it works. It also works maybe with people who are general audiences but a little more educated. Where it does not work is clearly these kind of areas. The other thing is you have to remember that many of these what they call WhatsApp killings are typically triggered by rumors which spread in very, very hyper-local environments. It could be between, it could begin in a village and then spread to another village in one remote corner of the country. And there's no way anyone, even in law enforcement, leave alone a small independent fact-checking agency like ours sitting in a city like Bombay, where I am right now, that can do anything about it. So these are really situations where law enforcement organizations or law enforcement authorities have to act and ideally preemptively, where people are told that do not believe rumors that are spread and reach you through platforms, social media platforms. And number two, more importantly, do not take the law into your own hands. If you see someone who is behaving suspiciously, then hand them over to the police or wait till the police arrive, particularly if it's far away from, far away from a city or a town. So that's really the problem, and it's clearly a law enforcement challenge, which in some states of India, the law enforcement authorities are beginning to act on and beginning to try and engage with local communities and so on. But the nature of this problem is a very large one.
Can you give me an example of an urban legend or myth or rumor that you guys have recently debunked?
So we debunk stuff all the time. I mean, we do it every day. I mean, some of the work we do is to do with what I would broadly call the communal, social, and political space. But we're also doing stuff around health, medicine, and areas like finance, where, for instance, there have been rumors about runs on banks which are owned by the government, and that's been going on for some time. So we've been debunking there. On the communal social side, we've been debunking content which has been particularly aimed at dividing communities, and there are several examples. There's something we did a few months ago, which was, there was a photograph shown of a religious leader from one community, and someone posted on a website saying that, this religious leader has been beaten up by members of another community, and it turned out that that person had actually been in a car accident, and that's how the religious leader, the local religious leader or a spiritual leader, received those injuries, and we debunked that. So there are many examples like that. We keep, like I said, encountering them on a day-to-day basis. In the area of health and medicine, there are many. I mean, these obviously are not the same as people dying or getting killed, but the outcomes can be quite dangerous because people tend to believe them. And there was one which involved a medicine, the specific rumor doing the rounds was that if you have this medicine, which was really like a paracetamol combination, you can die. And sales of that medicine, we were told, crashed, and the company was in a panic. And we found out that all that had happened, actually, there was something wrong with that medicine or that batch of medicine, as we found out from the company. But all that happened was that the efficacy of that medicine or that batch of medicines was weak, and therefore it did not work. So if you had a headache and you took that medicine from that particular batch, it didn't work. Surely no one died. But that was the rumor doing the round and spreading rapidly on social media platforms. So there are many, and like I said, in each category we find stuff, but obviously what worries us most is the kind which leads to deaths and mob vigilantism, but that's something that we can do very little about.
Right. So I'm going to ask you for a second to step out of your domain of expertise as a fact checker and a debunker and ask you about legislating against this, and whether you think it will be easy to do so, because we have India's highest court asking Parliament, sort this out, come up with something we can approve, come up with a law for us to implement in order to stop these vigilante killings, these mob killings that are usually spread through social media, especially things like WhatsApp, right? How do you actually legislate against that? Because do you punish the person who committed the act? Do you punish the person at ground zero or person zero who first spread the rumor? Is this going to be easy to do?
Right, and that's a great question that we are all grappling with. I think there are two or three segments to this question, and there are two or three kinds of answers to this. So first is that the social media platforms do bear some responsibility. So they have to work to make sure that their platforms become more transparent. So it's evident to people that there are messages that have been created elsewhere and are being forwarded, and I as a recipient should not necessarily believe it knowing that it's been forwarded. That's one. Now, of course, there is a very good chance that I would believe it also because it's been forwarded. The second part is clearly, like I said, a law enforcement challenge. People cannot, in any country, under any condition, take the law into their own hands. If I suspect someone of being a child lifter or of transporting something like beef, which is an issue in some states in India, I should hand that person over to the local police authorities. So I have to respect the rule of law, and there is no substitute for that, and there is no legislation that can go beyond what there is already. So that's the second part. The third is really awareness and education, which it all boils down to. People, the internet in India, the mobile phone or the smartphone equals the internet equals WhatsApp. And there are hundreds of millions of people who are getting hold or accessing of a smartphone and accessing the internet for the first time in their lives. And all of that has happened in recent years. So for them, what they see on a platform, on a social media platform, is almost like God's truth. So they have to be educated and made aware of the fact that you cannot trust something that you see like this. And it's really, I mean, this can work even for you and me. I mean, we have a pain on the side or in the back, and we Google and say, okay, if I have a pain in my back, what could it be? And typically, I go to a site like WebMD or Livestrong, and I find an answer which says, okay, it could be one of these 4 or 5 reasons. And there's a very good chance chance that you and I will believe it, because like, okay,
Right.
it may not be bone cancer, but it surely could be this, something more
I
minor.
always,
so we
I always
tend
look
to
at the worst
self-diagnose.
case scenario.
So if,
yeah, I always look at the worst case scenario and then I freak myself out, right?
Exactly.
So after
if
5
you and
minutes of
if you
Googling,
and I are going to believe
I'm
this,
on my
can you
deathbed,
imagine what someone who is typically illiterate, who's not exposed to the internet or or social media tends to react, or the way they could react?
Yeah. One of the things I want to do is get into WhatsApp and Facebook and whether they bear some responsibility, because in the West, a lot of the discussions are, and I want to ask you to answer this very briefly, if you don't mind. A lot of the discussions there are, this is end-to-end encryption. We want to keep the government out of spying into my private messages and my dirty pictures or whatever the hell it is, right? But on the other hand, we're having, in places like India, people are saying, well, there's a responsibility that the tech companies have as well in order not to facilitate something where this fake news is being spread. Do they have a responsibility to do something about it? Very briefly, please, sir.
Right. So like I said earlier, I think they have a clear responsibility to become more transparent. Have they become the most transparent at this point? I don't know. But this is a shifting goal. And we have to all understand that, a few years ago, all the technology companies were responding with extreme arrogance. I think today they've understood that this is a problem that they need to work very closely with government, societies, communities, people, and understand that you cannot step back and say that, I've created the platform and then what happens on it is not my responsibility. I think they've acknowledged that and they're beginning to work more closely. And I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But what needs to be done and what's the best response to each situation, whether it's country specific or community specific, is something that will evolve and will evolve as people like us and all of us put pressure on the technology companies, on law enforcement to become more proactive to situations like this. So it's a highly evolving situation and everyone has to change and evolve, and particularly the technology companies. But to pin the entire blame on them, I don't think is the right thing to do.
Govindraj Etiraj, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Do remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Nigeria's opposition joins forces to try to oust President Buhari. Will they succeed or be forced apart by their differences? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.